Her husband humiliated her for being a housewife. But at his award ceremony, something happened. The morning sun barely peeked through the curtains when Helen opened her eyes. She moved through the small kitchen with the precision of someone who had repeated the same motions for years, the sound of a kettle boiling, toast crisping in the old toaster, and the soft hum of the fridge were the background music of her mornings. Mia, her 9-year-old daughter, sat at the table with sleepy eyes, quietly watching her mother. Helen placed a warm plate in front of her, kissed her head, and turned to prepare Darren's lunch. He entered the kitchen without saying a word, picked up the lunchbox, glanced briefly at Helen, and left. No goodbye, no thank you, just silence. It had been like that for a while. Helen stood by the sink, watching his car disappear down the road. There was a time, years ago, when Darren used to greet her with a smile, kiss her on the forehead, and whisper how lucky he was. But over time, those gestures vanished, replaced by an unspoken coldness that had settled deep into the walls of their home. She turned to clean the table, wiping crumbs with a cloth more forcefully than necessary. She had no job, no social circle beyond the school gate greetings, and no place outside her home. Helen wasn't bitter, not yet. She believed her choice to stay home had value, that raising Mia with love and presence mattered. But she couldn't ignore how invisible she had become. Later that evening, while Helen was folding laundry in the living room, Darren sat on the couch scrolling through his phone. Mia was on the floor nearby, drawing quietly with colored pencils. Without looking up, Darren remarked, "You know, sometimes I wonder what it's like to be useful." The words dropped like cold water, and Helen paused, her fingers tightening on the soft fabric of a shirt. She didn't respond immediately. Mia looked up at her, confusion in her eyes. "I mean," Darren continued with a short laugh, "you stay home all day. Must be nice, right? No deadlines. No stress. Just cleaning and watching TV." Helen swallowed hard. Her voice trembled slightly as she replied, "Taking care of a home and raising our daughter isn't nothing." Darren rolled his eyes and waved his hand dismissively. "Spare me the housewife defense. I work with women who actually make a difference in the world." His tone was sharp, indifferent. Mia looked from one parent to the other, sensing something but not fully understanding. Helen turned away, forcing herself not to cry. She knew better than to argue. In that moment, she realized that the man she once believed would protect and cherish her now barely recognized her as anything more than background noise in his life. Sunday arrived, and Darren insisted Helen attend a dinner party with his colleagues. She hadn't wanted to go. She had nothing to wear that she considered elegant enough, and he made no effort to reassure her. "Just wear something clean," he had muttered while adjusting his tie. The restaurant was upscale, filled with the clinking of glasses and conversations in low, confident voices. Helen smiled politely, sitting quietly as Darren talked shop with his coworkers. A tall woman in a sleek suit leaned over and asked Helen what she did. When she replied, the woman blinked and said, "Oh. So, you're just a housewife?" before laughing lightly. Darren joined in with a grin. "Yeah, she's great at folding towels and making meatloaf. Real talent." Laughter erupted around the table, but Helen felt her face burn. She forced a smile, though inside she was unraveling. The conversation moved on, and she sat there, a ghost among professionals, each sip of her water feeling heavier than the last. She looked around and wondered if this was all life had planned for her. Her husband had turned her into a punchline, and no one thought twice about it. The ride home was quiet. Darren didn't seem to notice her silence. Maybe, she thought, he never really listened at all. Helen woke up on a crisp Wednesday morning. There were no flowers, no card on her pillow, no whispered happy birthday. It was just another morning. She dressed Mia for school, packed Darren's lunch, and went about her day. When Darren came home that evening, he dropped his keys on the counter, kissed Mia on the head, and talked about a new business trip. Helen stood there, waiting, hoping he might remember. But he didn't. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and asked her what was for dinner. That night, while Darren and Mia watched TV, Helen sat at the kitchen table alone, eating a slice of leftover cake she had baked herself. There were no candles, no song. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Helen didn't cry. She had moved beyond that. Her sadness had matured into a sort of dull acceptance. But deep inside, something was shifting. Something was aching to be noticed, to be seen. Her birthday had always meant something to her, not because of the gifts, but because it was one day when she used to feel acknowledged. That was gone now. As she washed the dishes, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window. She barely recognized the woman looking back. One afternoon, while Mia was at school and Darren was away on a retreat, Helen decided to clean out the attic. She moved boxes, brushed away cobwebs, and found an old trunk covered in dust. Inside were her sketchbooks, university notebooks, and a worn portfolio with her name written in bold across the front, Helen Morris, architecture major. She opened it carefully. The papers smelled of graphite and youth. Designs she once poured her soul into stared back at her. Curved hallways, open light concepts, community spaces. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages like they were parts of a forgotten self. She sat down on the wooden floor, surrounded by her past, and stared at a drawing she had titled The Quiet Space. It was a small library concept she'd created for her thesis. A wave of emotion rushed through her, longing, regret, a spark of pride. She had once dreamed of building places where people could feel safe, inspired, at peace. But that was before marriage, before Mia, before she gave up everything to be someone's wife. She had made the choice willingly, but now she wondered, had she lost herself completely in the process? That afternoon, she lingered in the attic longer than planned, holding the blueprints of a life she almost lived. Helen spent the following days revisiting her old notebooks, her fingertips brushing over pencil sketches and handwritten notes like they were relics of someone else's life. She remembered late nights in college studios, the thrill of presenting her projects, and the warmth in her professor's voice when he told her she had real talent. She had once been driven, creative, and admired. But all of that had faded into the background noise of domestic duties. Somewhere along the way, her spark had dimmed. She had chosen to walk away from that world when she discovered she was pregnant. Darren had just started his corporate job, and it made financial sense for her to stay home. At the time, she believed love and sacrifice were enough. But now, as she stared at her younger self's handwriting, it hurt to realize how much of her identity had been packed into this forgotten box. She closed the folder gently, but something inside her stirred. A quiet whisper that said, "It's not too late." One afternoon, Helen ran into an old college friend, Nina, while picking up Mia from school. Nina, dressed in a smart blazer with effortless confidence, recognized her immediately. "Helen? Is that really you?" Their conversation started with casual pleasantries, but soon turned deeper. Nina spoke of her architecture firm, her recent project in the city, and an upcoming design competition sponsored by a major institute. Helen nodded politely, hiding the sinking feeling in her chest. As Nina asked if she was still designing, Helen hesitated. "Not really," she said with a small laugh, I've been at home with Mia all these years. Nina smiled, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. Well, if you ever want to dust off those talents, let me know. The industry could use more minds like yours. Helen forced a smile and watched Nina walk away, her heels clicking with purpose. That night, Helen sat with her sketchpad for the first time in years, the memory of Nina's voice echoing in her mind. What Helen didn't know was that later that evening, Darren had spoken with Nina alone during a networking mixer. She had mentioned seeing Helen and how proud she was to hear that Helen had once been top of their class. Darren gave a short laugh and shrugged. Helen had potential, sure. But she's not the type to handle pressure. She's more comfortable folding laundry and watching soap operas now. Nina blinked, surprised by the bitterness in his tone, but said nothing. He went on, almost as if he needed to justify something to himself. She thinks drawing a few lines on paper makes her creative. It's not like she ever did anything real with it. Nina remained quiet, but the words unsettled her. She had seen the look in Helen's eyes, something dormant, not dead. Darren, on the other hand, seemed too eager to reduce her. When Nina left the event, she couldn't shake the feeling that Helen had more to offer than even Helen realized. Days passed, but the weight of Nina's words and Darren's indifference stayed with Helen. Late one night, after putting Mia to bed, Helen opened her laptop and searched for the competition Nina had mentioned. It was a national design challenge open to professionals and independents. Participants were to submit a concept for a community-centered space that embodied inclusivity and sustainability. Helen's heart raced as she read the guidelines. This was exactly the kind of work she once dreamed of doing. She hesitated for a long time, the cursor blinking on the screen. What if no one took her seriously? What if she failed? But slowly, carefully, she uploaded scans of her design from college, the quiet space, and began refining it. She stayed up past midnight, rewriting her proposal and adding touches she never had time to explore back then. Before closing her laptop, she entered her initials, HM, instead of her full name. She wasn't ready to be seen just yet. But she had taken a step. A real one. Helen started carving out secret windows of time during the day. When Darren was at work and Mia was at school, she pulled out her sketchpad, laptop, and coffee, and worked. At first, her lines were shaky. Her sense of proportion felt rusty. But soon, it came back, like a muscle that had merely been dormant. Her mind lit up in ways it hadn't in years. She reread articles on new building materials, watched design lectures online, and followed industry forums in silence. Each evening, she returned to her role as wife and mother. Darren never noticed anything different. If anything, he seemed more distracted, more preoccupied with his own career. Helen didn't mention the competition. She didn't want his opinion. Not yet. There was something sacred in this solitude, something powerful about having a part of herself that belonged to no one else. For the first time in a long time, she was doing something just for her, and it felt right. The next Friday, Darren invited Helen to accompany him to a corporate cocktail party. She wore her best dress, simple but elegant, and applied a touch of makeup, though her hands trembled slightly. At the event, Darren introduced her to a sleek, assertive woman named Camille, the wife of one of his clients. Camille runs a team of 30 engineers, Darren said proudly. She's what I call a high-functioning woman. Camille smiled politely, then asked Helen what she did. I'm at home full-time, Helen replied, trying to sound confident. Darren let out a short laugh. She's great at organizing closets and planning birthday parties. The conversation moved on, but the words lingered like smoke in Helen's mind. On the drive home, she stared out the window, silent. Darren tapped the steering wheel casually and said, "You could have at least tried to sound more impressive." Helen didn't answer. Her silence was not weakness anymore, it was armor. One morning, Mia came home excited about a new school initiative, a community redesign project where parents could volunteer to help students envision better shared spaces. Mia begged Helen to join. "You're so good at drawing in buildings, Mommy. Please?" Helen smiled and nodded, touched by her daughter's belief in her. The next week, she stood before a group of children and parents with a large pad of paper, outlining ideas. She guided the group with confidence, drawing layouts for shaded gardens, reading nooks, and accessible playgrounds. Some parents watched in quiet admiration, surprised by her knowledge. Helen felt alive again, seeing her ideas spark creativity in others. When they clapped after her short presentation, she felt something stir inside her that hadn't moved in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly useful, not because she served, but because she created. A few days later, the school principal stopped Helen after a meeting. "That was remarkable," he said. "You have a real talent. Have you ever considered returning to the field professionally?" Helen blushed, laughing nervously. "It's been a long time. I don't think anyone would take me seriously." But the principal shook his head. "Talent like that doesn't disappear. And people are always looking for fresh ideas from real community members." The encounter left Helen quiet for the rest of the day. That night, while Darren read emails at the dining table, she considered telling him. But before she could speak, he glanced up and said, "You didn't forget to order Mia's costume for the recital, right? That's more your territory." The moment passed. Helen folded the memory of the compliment into the growing drawer inside her mind, the one filled with truths Darren never saw. 2 weeks after submitting her design, Helen received an email that left her breathless. She had made the shortlist for the national design competition. Her project was now one of 20 selected for the final round. The panel praised her innovative community concept and invited her to present in the next phase. Still anonymously identified as HN, she stared at the screen, blinking rapidly, her heart thudding in disbelief and pride. She reread the message several times, her fingers trembling above the keyboard. She wanted to scream with joy, to share the news. But something held her back. Darren wouldn't celebrate this. He might scoff, dismiss it, or worse, remind her of what she had abandoned years ago. Instead, she closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, not uncertain or insecure, but quietly awakening. The following week, Helen received the final competition details. Each shortlisted designer would present their project over a secure platform using initials only. Judges wouldn't see faces or know backgrounds. Helen felt strangely comforted by this anonymity. She could be judged for her ideas alone, not her resume, not her domestic status, not her age. She rehearsed daily, refining her talking points, timing her pauses, controlling her breath. On the night of her virtual presentation, she tucked Mia into bed with a long hug and set up her laptop in the quiet study. Her voice shook slightly at first, but as she explained her vision for the quiet space, something inside her steadied. She spoke not just as a designer but as someone who understood isolation, who had lived through invisibility and wanted to create spaces where no one felt that way again. When she finished, there was silence, then applause. A few days after her presentation, Helen sat in the kitchen, sipping tea when Darren walked in holding a piece of paper. His eyes were sharp. "What's this?" he asked, tossing her old sketch with quiet space, revised written in the corner. Helen's stomach dropped. Just something I've been working on, she said quietly. Darren scoffed, shaking his head. You're wasting time. You've got responsibilities. Don't get carried away playing architect. Helen didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just stared at him, something inside her quietly breaking. Darren leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. You think anyone's going to take a housewife seriously in a field like that? You're lucky I don't mind you staying home, but don't mistake comfort for capability. Helen turned away. She didn't want him to see the emotion on her face. She knew now, he would never see her clearly again. That night, Helen sat alone in the living room, her sketchpad untouched on the table. Darren's words echoed in her mind. Wasting time. Playing architect. Her fingers hovered over her laptop, over the email from the competition committee asking for her final revisions before the winners were selected. She stared at the blinking cursor, doubt creeping in. Maybe it had all been a fantasy. Maybe she'd overestimated herself. Her eyes burned as she looked at her notes, her heart heavy. She moved the cursor toward the withdraw submission link. Her hand trembled. She thought about Darren's laughter, the way he so easily dismissed everything she'd worked on. She nearly clicked. But then, just as she was about to shut it all down, she heard the soft padding of Mia's footsteps in the hallway. Helen turned, her heart tightening. Mia shuffled into the room, clutching a folded piece of paper. I wrote you something, she said shyly, holding it out. Helen unfolded the letter and read, written in crayon, You are the smartest mommy. I want to build a house with you one day. I'm proud of you. Beneath it was a drawing of Helen standing beside a tall building, holding Mia's hand. Tears welled in Helen's eyes. Her hand slowly pulled away from the keyboard. She reached for her sketchpad instead, holding it close like a lifeline. Mia climbed into her lap and rested her head on her chest. Don't stop drawing, she whispered. Helen kissed her forehead gently. That night, while Mia slept, Helen worked. She revised her final submission, reimagined her layout, strengthened her concept. Darren's voice was no longer the one that mattered. She wasn't working for him. She was working for the little girl who believed she could build the world. The final review panel was scheduled virtually. Helen joined the meeting from the study, nerves fluttering in her chest. She was one of 5 finalists. The committee members appeared on screen, their names and affiliations muted for anonymity. When it was her turn, she spoke with calm clarity, explaining the intention behind each design element, from the natural lighting to the sensory-friendly quiet zones. One judge interrupted to ask how she came up with the concept. Helen paused for a moment, then said, I know what it's like to feel invisible. I wanted to create a place where people could feel seen, even in silence. The room was quiet for a beat too long. Then someone nodded slowly. Thank you. That's powerful. When the presentation ended, Helen closed her laptop and exhaled deeply. No matter the outcome, she knew she had spoken from her truth. The next week, an online architecture blog published a shortlist of the 5 anonymous finalists, praising their work. Helen's project, labeled simply as HM, received glowing reviews. Social media took notice. Comments flooded in, calling the design elegant, empathetic, and forward-thinking. Helen read the words with wide eyes. Who is HM? One commenter asked. Whoever she is, she understands community in a way most professionals don't. Helen didn't share the article with Darren. She simply printed it and slipped it into her drawer, beside Mia's letter. She kept moving through her days as usual, school drop-offs, meals, chores, but now there was a light in her eyes Darren couldn't dim. Outside, strangers were beginning to see the brilliance he refused to acknowledge. And Helen? She had stopped waiting for his permission to feel proud. One morning, Darren came home with an invitation in his hand and a triumphant smile on his face. "I've been nominated for a Business Leadership Award," he announced, tossing the envelope on the kitchen counter. "Big deal. The firm wants me to bring a guest. That'll be you, obviously." Helen raised her eyes from the dishwater. "That's great," she said, unsure if he even noticed the tension in her voice. He didn't ask if she had anything scheduled or if she wanted to go. It was assumed. Helen nodded politely, hiding the truth. She had received an email from the design committee earlier that same day. All finalists were invited to the same gala to reveal the winner. She was stunned by the coincidence. She reread the invitation twice. Her presentation had moved the judges. And now she would attend, anonymously, as both guest and finalist. The night of the ceremony, Helen wore a deep navy dress Mia had helped her choose. As Darren rushed to greet colleagues, Helen scanned the event hall. Everything gleamed: polished chandeliers, gold-accented decor, a room full of people dressed in confidence. She stood quietly, holding her purse, unnoticed. An organizer approached her, whispering, "You're HM, correct? Please stay near the stage when we begin the design awards section." Helen nodded discreetly. She spotted Nina at a nearby table, graceful, self-assured, seated beside the evening's MC. Helen's heart pounded. Darren returned to her side, oblivious. "Try not to look nervous," he murmured. "Just smile when they call my name." She didn't respond. He had no idea that his moment in the spotlight would soon be eclipsed by a truth he never expected. The evening unfolded smoothly, with the business awards announced first. Darren was called to the stage to accept his Innovative Leadership Award. He delivered a confident speech, mentioning family once in passing. Helen clapped politely. As he stepped down, the host paused. "Now, onto a very special recognition. This year's National Design Finalist made waves with a concept called the quiet space." Whispers spread across the room. Helen felt the blood drain from her face. "And we are proud to announce that the winning entry, submitted anonymously as HM, belongs to Helen Morris." Gasps echoed. Darren turned in his seat, frozen. Helen rose slowly. She walked toward the stage, her spine straight, her expression calm. As she passed Darren, their eyes met. He looked as if the floor had vanished beneath him. The applause rose as Helen took the microphone. She looked out at the room, not as a guest, not as someone's wife, but as the winner. "I designed the quiet space because I've spent years learning what silence can do to a person," she began. "But also what it can teach you. Silence teaches you to listen, really listen, to what you've forgotten about yourself." Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She thanked the judges, the panel, and lastly, her daughter Mia. The room erupted in renewed applause. Nina stood, smiling with quiet pride. The spotlight bathed Helen in warm light, and for once, it felt earned. Darren sat stiffly, clapping mechanically. A man at his table leaned toward him and whispered, "That's your wife?" Darren nodded slowly, the the weight of his own blindness settling over him like a lead curtain. The host returned to the stage and said, "We invite both award winners to say a few words together as partners in excellence, business and design." Helen stepped aside. All eyes turned to Darren. The microphone waited. He stood, unsure, adjusting his tie. His speech was short, awkward. "I didn't know. I mean, I'm proud." Surprised, but proud. The room grew quiet. It was clear to everyone, he had no idea who his wife really was. Helen smiled graciously and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said softly, but her tone carried layers he couldn't decipher. The press took photos. One captured Darren's stunned face beside Helen's composed smile. By the end of the night, the story wasn't about Darren's leadership. It was about the quiet woman beside him, who had finally been heard. As the applause faded and the event moved on, Helen stood quietly in a hallway outside the ballroom. A young architecture student approached her, eyes wide. You inspired me tonight," she said. "Your words, your design, it's the kind of work I dream of doing." Helen smiled warmly and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Then don't wait for anyone's permission. You already have everything you need." Moments later, a journalist approached. "Your project has gone viral," she said, holding up her phone. "Everyone's talking about how no one saw you coming." Helen nodded gently. "Sometimes people confuse silence with absence," she replied. "But silence is often where real things are built." She excused herself, stepping away just as Darren finally appeared, looking disoriented and subdued. "We should talk," he said quietly. Helen met his gaze but didn't answer. The drive home was silent. Darren gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. Helen sat beside him, looking out the window at the city lights. He finally spoke. "I didn't know you were working on anything. Why didn't you tell me?" Helen turned slowly. "You never asked," she said. Her voice wasn't cold, only honest. Darren said nothing. He seemed smaller now, deflated. The weight of his arrogance had finally settled on his shoulders. Back at home, Helen walked into Mia's room and kissed her goodnight. She stood for a moment, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, then went to her own room. Darren followed her. "I want to fix things," he said. "I do." Helen looked at him calmly. "That's not something you say. It's something you prove, over time." She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. She simply turned off the light and went to bed. In the weeks that followed, Helen received numerous offers from firms, schools, and organizations asking her to speak, teach, or design. Her inbox overflowed. She accepted one offer from a design firm that allowed her to work flexibly from home. She wasn't chasing recognition, just space to create. Darren, on the other hand, grew quieter. He made efforts, small, awkward gestures, but the dynamic between them had changed forever. He saw now what he had overlooked, a woman with brilliance, passion, and resilience. He noticed the way others looked at her with admiration. The same admiration he had failed to give. At dinner one night, he watched her explain a concept to Mia using building blocks. Mia's eyes sparkled. Darren smiled sadly. He had spent years diminishing the very person he now wished he had celebrated all along. Helen's days were different now. She worked from a small sunlit room she transformed into her studio. Drafting tables, models, and soft jazz filled the space. Mia would often curl up in the corner with a book, occasionally asking questions about quiet spaces or invisible doors. Helen's work was featured in a community center project, and she started mentoring women returning to creative fields after career breaks. She felt no bitterness toward Darren, only a kind of solemn clarity. He had been part of her story, one that taught her how to fight for her own voice. They still lived together, co-parenting Mia with care, but the balance had shifted. Darren had lost the pedestal he once stood on. Helen hadn't replaced him on it. She had simply stepped away from needing one at all. Months later, Helen stood on a stage again, this time at a local university, speaking to a group of students. Mia sat in the front row, legs swinging, pride shining in her eyes. Helen spoke about creativity, but also about silence. About the years no one saw her, and the strength it took to see herself again. "You don't have to roar to be powerful," she said. "Sometimes the quietest voices build the strongest foundations." After the lecture, as people crowded around her, Helen caught a glimpse of Darren standing alone in the back of the room. He clapped softly, eyes full of something close to reverence. She nodded once in acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to the young women in front of her, each of them looking at her not as a wife or a mother, but as the builder she had always been.